Just the facts. Faz, ma'am. It's NES Works, episode 143.
I help people with problems.
Problem solver.
I'm more of a problem eliminator.
At last, the NES's crowning moment. Or is it all much Fuh-zahn-ado about nothing? Personally, my vote is on the former. Okay, so maybe crowning moment is a bit much. But Fuh-zahn-ado brings together a lot of different threads we've been following throughout the NES's existence for 2 years of releases at this point, and it arguably does it better than anything we've seen so far. Certainly I'm not alone in thinking this. Xanadu comes to us from developer Hudson, a company with its own publishing presence in the US, and who could surely have shipped this cartridge under the auspices of their own label. But they didn't, because Nintendo itself decided to grace this release with the rare and vaunted status of a first-party title. Xanadu shipped as a Nintendo game, capital N, capital G, enjoying all the benefits of that hallowed place in the universe. This means that Fuh-zahn-ado shipped in a box that echoed the design of The Legend of Zelda's packaging. Since no one bothered to re-engineer the game to include a battery backup, leaving us with a truly miserable password experience full of ambiguous alphanumeric characters, it wasn't quite cool enough for a gold cartridge or die-cut window in the front of the box. Even so, the box front illustration featured a metallic-style crest and a cool calligraphic logo. All in all, a classy, minimalist package that stood out on shelves and instantly called to mind the Zelda games. Nintendo's direct support also means that Fuh-zahn-ado enjoyed bountiful coverage in Nintendo Power, highlighting a game whose cover admittedly said nothing much about it besides this is a less luxurious Zelda, and whose title amounted to a confusing mouthful of letters. The 6th issue of the magazine included a brief 3-page overview of the opening hour of the quest and a breakdown of the weapons, spells, and armor available for use. Issue 7 went into much greater detail, with 10 pages of walkthrough tips that broke down the first half to 2/3 of the game in great detail. This includes the usual photographic screenshot maps of the overworld and fortresses leading into the world tree where the quest's final objectives awaited. The extra coverage came in handy as Fuh-zahn-ado's quest demanded a fair amount of exploration on the player's part and could lead to some fairly opaque dead ends. Still, I have to say that as this style of game went in the 8-bit era, that is, the proto-Metroidvania genre, Fuh-zahn-ado may well be the most intuitive and least vexing of them all. We've reached the latter half of 1989 in the NES release chronology, and that means that developers have largely stopped releasing games in this vein in Japan. The exploratory platform adventure burned brightly on Famicom in 1987 and 88, but as I've mentioned before in Metroidvania Works, it fizzled out around 1989. The end of the 8-bit Metroidvania boom coincided with the Japanese launch of Super Mario Bros. 3, which may or may not be directly culpable for the shift in creative direction, but certainly from this point on, game developers in Japan would generally focus on keeping platform action games more oriented on platforming and action, while pushing exploration and RPG components into turn-based role-playing adventures and top-down action-driven Zelda-alikes. It took a while for those ripples to die down here, though, because of localization delays. Xanadu was nearly 2 years old by the time it reached the US. It took even longer to hit the States than Zelda 2, with all of its chip shortage delays. Again, Fuh-zahn-ado used passwords rather than a battery backup, so I couldn't really say why it didn't arrive in the US sooner, but Nintendo really seems to have developed a real fixation in 1989 for bringing long, involved, role-playing quests to the US well past their original sell-by date. I mean, Fuh-zahn-ado shipped for NES alongside Dragon Warrior, a game even longer in the tooth, which, in my opinion, was something of a tactical error on Nintendo's part. Both games drew upon the same sources of inspiration, but one of them looked good, had great tunes, played pretty smoothly, and presented a convoluted but ultimately accessible adventure. The other was Dragon Warrior. The reality is that Fuh-zahn-ado does almost everything that makes Dragon Warrior appealing, but it does it a lot more intuitively and without the need for a ton of menus. It uses action-based exploratory and combat paradigms rather than making players slog slowly through text menus, and grinding here is largely non-existent. Consider, one of Dragon Quest's big innovations was that dying in combat didn't wipe all the progress you had made since your last check-in with the king. Instead, you retained your experience and only lost half your gold. Xanadu goes one better. Based on your current experience level, you continue after death with a fixed amount of gold in your coffers. Find yourself broke? You can die and continue from the nearest guru with a freshly replenished pile of golds in your inventory. The higher your experience level, the larger your resurrection stipend. In fact, that's literally all that experience points do for you in Fuh-zahn-ado. Your level has no impact on your health, your defense, or your attack power. All of those combat factors derive from the quality of your equipment, like in, Zelda. Experience gain simply grants you a better rank, and your rank determines how much cash you're reborn into the world with. It's an unusually forward-thinking approach to punishing players for failure, but then a lot about Fuh-zahn-ado feels unusually forward-thinking. Admittedly, it does suffer from some of the technical limitations of the era. For example, you only have 8 inventory slots for carrying tools and healing items, and items of the same type don't stack, and you only get a single use per instance of an item, like a key or matic. So you spend a lot of time juggling inventory, reaching doors only to learn that you need a specific key type, trudging back to a shop to acquire one, and hoping you don't encounter any nested doors, which of course happens a lot in the latter portions of the game. Worse, locks regenerate anytime you zone out to a new screen, Xanadu playing out via flip screen progression rather than incorporating scrolling backgrounds, and that includes non-traditional locks like walls that need to be broken through with matics. You can, for example, briefly soft lock your progress in the early going if you backtrack at an inopportune moment and cause a wall to regenerate after expending your first matic. And you'll frequently make progression into a quest only to find out that you didn't correctly predict the assortment of keys you need to advance, sending you backtracking to find another shop. But compared to the head-slapping design choices we've seen in Fuh-zahn-ado's peers, these amount to minor annoyances at worst. Xanadu largely steers clear of the flaws and frustrations of its contemporaries, which is to say exploratory platform adventures originally released in Japan in 1987. That includes Zelda 2, Castlevania 2, Rambo, and The Goonies 2, among others. Unlike those games, Fuh-zahn-ado doesn't pad out its playtime with obscure objectives or vague, misleading clues, and it generally avoids setting you back a huge distance when you die, so long as you explore thoroughly and find the cathedrals that pop up as waypoints in its more sprawling quests. Take, for example, the game's first significant quest, opening the door into the lower structure of the world tree where the adventure takes place. This particular door doesn't just require a key, it also demands you activate a fountain to keep water flowing to the tree's roots. In order to get the fountain running again, you need to purify multiple springs located nearby. Each spring requires you to acquire a healing elixir and complete a different task, beating a dwarf boss, finding a hidden spring in the sky, and entering a fortress. You can get the lowdown on each of these tasks and the steps you need to take in order to complete them by simply talking to every non-player character you meet along the way. Even the hidden spring has plenty of breadcrumbs to lead you to it, with NPCs telling you to hunt for boots of flight and where you should employ them. And the elixirs you need to revive the springs appear as a regenerating item inside of a fortress, which you can collect as many times as you need. There is a small amount of skill gating involved, primarily where the spring in the mini-fortress beneath the hidden Sky Island is concerned, as you need to navigate your way past a mini-boss in order to reach the spring. If the mini-boss kills you, you'll automatically use your precious elixir to heal yourself, which means you'll have to backtrack into the upper fortress in order to collect another one. But again, this is a minor inconvenience, and as in Dragon Quest, the modest penalty for failure means that you just need to keep trying, and eventually you'll succeed. Provided you remember your mantra and don't feel discouraged. Seriously though, Nintendo really did double down on the role-playing angle in 1989 by licensing both Dragon Quest and Fuh-zahn-ado as first-party titles. I don't know what the chicken and egg situation looked like behind the scenes here. Did Nintendo expect role-playing games to take off in the US the way that they had in Japan, and just wanted to get ahead of the trend? Or were they trying to juice the trend themselves? Whatever the inside story may be, the end result is that they delivered 2 heavy-hitting RPG experiences within the space of a few weeks. Of the two, of course, Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior would prove far and away the more influential work. The US console market saw dozens of games that followed in its footsteps over the next few years, and those represent just a meager fraction of the overall number of Dragon Quest-alikes that appeared on Famicom, Game Boy, Super Famicom, PC Engine, and Mega Drive in Japan. However, I have to give Fuh-zahn-ado the nod for feeling a whole lot more relevant today than the original Dragon Warrior does. In a lot of ways, you could believe that Hudson's little Earth Tone adventure was created as a demake of modern-day action RPGs in the FromSoft vein. Look at it. There's almost no saturated color to be found here. Xanadu takes place in the withering roots and branches of a world tree being starved of light and life. The game's color palette speaks to blight and drought. Meanwhile, the protagonist's appearance steadily changes as he acquires better gear. And not in a superficial Zelda Simon's Quest sense where you can see him equip a different shield or change color palettes. No, I mean that the nameless avatar of Xanadu begins the game barehanded, wearing a simple tunic, and his sprite gradually evolves as his equipment improves. His sword grows larger, his armor beefs up, and his shields change until you reach the endgame wearing a full suit of plate mail and wielding the elaborate multi-pronged Dragon Slayer sword, which looks like it's halfway to becoming the legendary Shichi Shito. Like those current-day games, Fuh-zahn-ado also emphasizes timing and rhythm in its action. Your hero moves pretty slowly and lacks the athleticism of a Link or the range of a Simon Belmont, so learning the cadences of his physical attacks and the optimal striking range of his weapons becomes essential to survival. You need to hit enemies with the tip of your blade, the nature of which varies based on the length of the blade you happen to be wielding. And different enemies move in their own patterns, making careful timing essential. Your shield can dull the impact of enemy projectiles, provided you happen to be facing into the attack, without lowering your shield for a sword strike. You can leap mini attacks or even clear small enemies with a jump, so you need to get a feel for the hero's slightly floaty physics. You also need to get a handle on the protagonist's limitations, such as the fact that you can't duck to strike low enemies. So until you acquire a long blade, you need to blast them with magic spells. A lot of this really only factors in at the beginning of the adventure, when your low-rank protagonist barely has 2 golds to rub together and has to approach weakling enemies with caution. But it's not like Kid Icarus, where the earliest stages are the most unreasonably difficult, and making any headway whatsoever feels like an epic accomplishment. The limitations of your adventurer at the journey's outset simply force you to engage with all of Xanadu's mechanics straight away, nudging you into the cadences of the play mechanics and preparing you for the more demanding challenges down the road. And really, Fuh-zahn-ado never gets that complicated. You collect equipment along a linear path where more expensive gear equals better gear. You don't even need to worry about inventory management, since acquiring a new weapon simply replaces the old one in your menus. All in all, Fuh-zahn-ado does a great job of balancing simplicity and depth. It's the kind of game that requires you to think about the tasks ahead and become intimate with the lay of the land, because you do need to backtrack a fair amount in order to complete quest objectives and make progress. But the overall structure of the game leads you inevitably forward. It never dispenses needlessly opaque tasks, and it provides ample guidance by way of NPCs. And once your eyes adjust to the drab monochromatic color palette, the game looks pretty great too, whether you're struggling through swirls of mist or basking in the occasional pop of blue sky. Every location has its own memorable look and style, which is no small task in a world built entirely of shades of brown. Xanadu's accessibility seems all the more remarkable when you stop to consider its lineage. Despite not being branded as such in the US, Xanadu belongs to the same franchise as Legacy of the Wizard. Specifically, they both belong to Nihon Falcom's Dragon Slayer series, making them cousins many times removed to today's The Legend of Heroes games. Xanadu is more of a second cousin though, a brother from some other mother. In Japan, Legacy of the Wizard shipped unambiguously as the 4th entry in the Dragon Slayer series. In the US, it shipped under its completely new and made-up title, because no Dragon Slayer game had ever come here before, and in any case there had been a Disney movie called Dragon Slayer in 1981 that might have caused marketing or legal problems for the game. Xanadu was the second Dragon Slayer title to have reached the US, but it showed up here with its Japanese title intact. It originally shipped for Famicom under the name Fuh-zahn-ado, which made sense. It was the Famicom adaptation of Xanadu, Xanadu being the second chapter of the Dragon Slayer series. The word adaptation does have to do a lot of heavy lifting. By no measure did Fuh-zahn-ado directly or faithfully convert the 1985 computer game into console form. Instead, Falcom licensed the property to Hudson, who promptly set about doing their own thing with it. This would happen again with the Ys series a few years later, when Falcom allowed both Hudson and Tonkin House to create the 4th entry in the Ys franchise, neither of which resembled the other. Hudson presumably looked at the original Xanadu and realized it would either be too technically demanding for the NES hardware, or more likely, too off-putting to the younger, more action-loving audience that consoles pulled compared to computers at the time. Whatever the case, they radically overhauled Xanadu into an entirely new game. You can see architectural evidence of its origins buried beneath the strata here. The original Xanadu did incorporate side-view action, but only for the sake of navigating the hub world. Inside dungeons and towers, Xanadu shifted to more of a top-down perspective, the opposite of Zelda 2 in a sense. But unlike Zelda 2, Xanadu featured no side-view combat whatsoever. When players engaged with enemies in Xanadu, the player's viewpoint shifted to a top-down angle that almost 100% certainly inspired the original Legend of Zelda, or at least co-inspired it alongside the Tower of Druaga. It faked the look of an action game, but the original Xanadu still kept its feet firmly planted in the soil of role-playing traditions. For Fuh-zahn-ado, Hudson simply leaned more sincerely into the action side of the action RPG. They swept away the top-down exploration and breakaway encounters, giving dungeon interiors the same look as the outside world and fully incorporating combat into that exploratory viewpoint. In other words, they looked at Dragon Slayer-inspired action RPGs like Zelda 2 and Dragon Buster and said, let's do that. Legacy of the Wizard made its Japanese debut around the same time as Fuh-zahn-ado, but the two games felt entirely different. Legacy of the Wizard revolved around environmental puzzles and swapping between multiple characters who relied entirely on ranged combat and controlled pretty simply. Fuh-zahn-ado largely ignores the puzzle action aspect of the Dragon Slayer series, putting its emphasis on the action RPG stylings of the aforementioned arcade and console hits. Wielding both swords and spells, managing tricky platform jumps, and blocking enemy attacks with carefully timed shield-based defense, the protagonist of Fuh-zahn-ado has more in common with the protagonists of console action games than he does with any of the heroes of Falcom's theoretical action RPGs like Romancia, Sorcerian, or even Legacy of the Wizard. This almost certainly explains why Hudson called it Fuh-zahn-ado instead of just Xanadu, Dragon Slayer 2. It ended up being a completely different experience from the core Dragon Slayer games, despite the fact that you can see echoes of the original computer game in the design of towns and fortress facades. Oh, and the fact that the ultimate sword you use to save the day is, again, called the Dragon Slayer. Xanadu changed much more than simply the player's point of view and the nature of combat against enemies. It introduces a new story in which the elven protagonist returns to his home at the base of the World Tree, only to find a desolate ruin overrun by dwarves that have gone mad and mutated due to the poisonous influence of a meteorite. Rather than present players with a dense, puzzle-like outer world that hides the entrances to dungeons and labyrinths within the space of a few screens, as in Xanadu, Xanadu allows itself to sprawl along the length and breadth of the World Tree. Players steadily advance into the tree, encountering pockets of civilization among the overrun passages, towns and chapels, and the odd wilderness key shop. The game plays out in phases, with the world broken up into more or less self-contained regions. You can certainly backtrack to previous spaces if you have enough keys and mattocks, but you rarely need to. Xanadu walks a delicate tightrope between fidelity to its source material, appeal to a console-focused audience, and accessibility versus its console peers. While I don't think it's entirely perfect, it really is one of the most successful efforts in this area of its era. And it clearly looked good enough and played well enough that it still held up nicely for localization by Nintendo 2 years after its Japanese debut. You can really understand why Nintendo chose to pick this one up to publish themselves. It's a top-notch exploration of the action RPG format, and honestly, it made for a more compelling introduction to the principles of role-playing than Dragon Warrior. Next time on NES Works, learning the alphabet, beginning with HAL.